On Monday, 21, the President of Russia made what many observers are calling a notable shift in his diplomatic posture regarding the protracted war in Ukraine, publicly stating for the first time in years that he is open to engaging in direct peace negotiations with Kyiv. This declaration, which broke with a long-standing stance of limited or mediated communication, is being interpreted as a potential turning point, or at least a strategic recalibration, in the Kremlin's approach to the conflict. The announcement comes at a time of mounting international scrutiny and growing pressure from Washington, which has consistently urged Moscow to show tangible signs of willingness to pursue a negotiated settlement to the war that has now entered its fourth year. The broader context of this development is critical. For months, Western governments have intensified diplomatic and economic pressure on Russia, using sanctions, arms deliveries to Ukraine, and high-level talks to isolate the Kremlin diplomatically. Within this framework, Moscow's apparent openness to bilateral talks could be a tactical move aimed at easing that isolation, countering negative perceptions abroad, and potentially fracturing Western unity on Ukraine. Analysts caution, however, that the Kremlin's motivations remain unclear, whether this is a genuine step toward peace or a calculated maneuver to buy time, reframe narratives, and influence the diplomatic agenda. The Russian leader's remarks were delivered just after a short-lived ceasefire of 30 hours, which he had unilaterally declared over the Easter holiday. This brief pause in hostilities, while not unprecedented, stood out as an uncommon gesture from a government that has largely dismissed or downplayed overtures for ceasefires unless tied to specific strategic gains. The Easter truce marked the first such attempt at halting violence since previous failed efforts at establishing humanitarian corridors and local ceasefires in contested zones. Despite the symbolic value of the gesture, its effectiveness was limited. Hostilities quickly resumed once the ceasefire expired, and both Russia and Ukraine accused each other of violating the terms of the pause, allegations that further deepened mutual distrust and underscored the fragility of any temporary agreements reached without mutual coordination or third-party enforcement. In sum, while the Russian president's announcement has drawn international attention for its apparent shift in tone, it is met with a mix of cautious optimism and deep skepticism. For many, it raises more questions than it answers. Is this a genuine pivot toward diplomacy, or merely a strategic gesture in response to external pressures and internal calculations? The coming weeks, especially as new diplomatic engagements unfold across European capitals, may provide a clearer picture of whether this overture marks the beginning of a new phase in the war, or just another pause in a long and brutal standoff. Meanwhile, Kyiv has officially confirmed the dispatch of a high-level delegation to London, where Ukrainian representatives are scheduled to meet on Wednesday, 23, with senior officials from the United States, the United Kingdom, and several key European Union member states. This diplomatic engagement marks the continuation of a series of high-stakes international consultations, following a round of preliminary talks held the previous week in Paris. The overarching objective of these meetings is to identify viable diplomatic and strategic frameworks that could pave the way toward a sustainable resolution of the war, which has claimed tens of thousands of lives, displaced millions across Ukraine and neighboring countries, and disrupted global energy and food supply chains, particularly through the blockade and militarization of Black Sea routes. The London summit is expected to focus not only on ceasefire mechanisms and humanitarian access, but also on broader questions of post-war reconstruction, long-term security guarantees for Ukraine, and the future architecture of European security. Ukrainian officials are reportedly pushing for a firm, united stance among Western allies to counter what they perceive as a pattern of disingenuous proposals and tactical delays from Moscow. There is also growing interest in discussing the role of non-NATO partners, such as Japan and Australia, in supporting diplomatic and economic stabilization efforts, signaling the truly global scope of concern surrounding the ongoing conflict. At the same time, the Kremlin has issued a series of public statements indicating its willingness to engage with what it terms any initiative that contributes to peace. Russian officials have stressed their openness to dialogue, including direct talks, provided they are conducted without preconditions and with what Moscow describes as mutual respect for national interests. This language, while less confrontational than in previous months, is still viewed with suspicion by many in Kyiv and across Western capitals. The specific mention of possible bilateral negotiations with Ukraine is particularly notable, as it represents a marked departure from the Kremlin's earlier insistence on mediated or multilateral formats, often through forums that include Russia's strategic partners, such as China or Turkey. Nonetheless, Ukrainian authorities have responded with guarded skepticism, pointing to recent events that, in their view, reveal a dissonance between Russia's rhetoric and its actions. Despite the temporary 30-hour Easter ceasefire announced by Moscow, multiple Ukrainian regions reported renewed shelling and drone attacks during the period in which hostilities were officially paused. These incidents have reinforced the perception in Kyiv that the Kremlin's peace overtures may be more performative than sincere, calculated to ease diplomatic pressure and reshape international narratives, rather than reflecting a genuine commitment to de-escalation or conflict resolution. For Ukraine, any credible peace process must be anchored in verifiable commitments, territorial integrity, and accountability for wartime actions, conditions that, so far, remain unmet. This diplomatic balancing act, therefore, plays out amid an atmosphere of strategic mistrust, where every signal is parsed for intent and every proposal is weighed against battlefield realities. As negotiations tentatively proceed on the global stage, the road to any meaningful resolution remains fraught with complexity, conditioned as much by historical grievances and national sovereignty as by shifting power dynamics among global actors. The U.S. government, for its part, has expressed a clear willingness to support the extension of the ceasefire, emphasizing its commitment to fostering any diplomatic efforts that could lead to de-escalation and a long-term solution to the conflict. Washington has underscored that maintaining a pause in hostilities, even temporarily, would provide a vital window for humanitarian assistance to reach civilian populations trapped in conflict zones, and would create an opportunity for further dialogue. U.S. officials have pointed to the potential of a ceasefire extension as an essential step in laying the groundwork for a more comprehensive peace process, in line with Washington's long-standing objective of supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. However, Kyiv's stance on the ceasefire remains more cautious and specific in its demands. Ukrainian authorities have strongly advocated for a pause in fighting that would last at least 30 days, with a clear and focused aim: the protection of civilian areas and critical infrastructure. This extended break in hostilities would, according to Ukrainian officials, provide the necessary space to bolster defensive positions, evacuate civilians from high-risk zones, and prevent further escalation in densely populated regions that have already borne the brunt of Russia's military assaults. For Ukraine, the key is not just the cessation of violence, but the restoration of security for its citizens and the prevention of further war crimes that have plagued the conflict thus far. Nevertheless, there are mounting concerns among Ukrainian officials regarding the credibility of Russia's commitment to the ceasefire. According to multiple sources close to the Ukrainian government, reports of continued bombings and military strikes during the truce only deepen the skepticism surrounding Moscow's true intentions. These breaches, seen as violations of the spirit and letter of the ceasefire, have led Ukrainian leaders to argue that Russia's ongoing military actions undermine its credibility on the world stage, casting serious doubt on the sincerity of its proposed peace initiatives. The continuing attacks, which have targeted civilian infrastructure, are perceived as evidence that Russia has no intention of bringing an end to the hostilities, but rather aims to stretch the conflict out over a longer period of time. This, in turn, feeds into the broader perception in Kyiv and across the West that Russia's endgame remains the indefinite occupation of Ukrainian territory and the destabilization of the region. Despite these concerns, the international diplomatic landscape is becoming increasingly dynamic, with a growing sense of urgency surrounding the prospect of renewed talks. Although Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has not yet directly addressed the Kremlin's call for bilateral negotiations, recent developments in European capitals suggest that international pressure is mounting for a new cycle of dialogue. European Union leaders, as well as officials from the US and other NATO countries, have reiterated their support for a negotiated settlement, even as they maintain that any peace talks must be based on respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. The diplomatic activity in capitals such as Berlin, Paris, and Brussels indicates a concerted push to revive dialogue, with leaders emphasizing that now, amid shifting military realities on the ground, could be the critical moment to reinitiate meaningful negotiations. However, the path to peace remains fraught with complexity. The gap between Moscow's proposals and Ukraine's non-negotiable terms, such as the full withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukrainian territory, remains wide. While Russia seeks to frame the conflict in terms of broader geopolitical security concerns, Ukraine is determined to secure not only its territorial integrity but also accountability for the widespread destruction and loss of life caused by the invasion. It remains uncertain whether the diplomatic pressure currently being applied will be sufficient to bridge these differences or if it will lead to a renewed deadlock. As of now, the question remains whether the diplomatic rhetoric will be translated into concrete actions that bring the world closer to a sustainable, lasting peace. The stakes are high, and the international community is closely watching to see if this period of diplomatic activity will lead to a breakthrough, or if it will simply mark another chapter in an ongoing war that shows few signs of abating. With both sides holding firm to their positions, the outcome of these negotiations will likely define the future of the conflict, as well as the broader geopolitical order.